Hi, this is Tony Northrup for Train Signals SSCP Certification Video Training Course, and in this lesson I'd like to talk about malicious activity. This is bad stuff not being done by software, but really being done by thoughtful people, the most dangerous threat, really. First up is one of the most historically dangerous types of attacks, and that's social engineering. Social engineering attacks manipulate people into doing something or giving up some kind of information. They're extremely common and they've been around for a long time, and they still continue to be extremely effective because they're attacking people, and we're these imperfect emotional things and we can be intimidated and scared and tricked. Computers are so much easier to protect than people, right? Social engineering attacks bypass all the technical controls because what you're doing is you're calling a person and tricking that person with legitimate credentials and authorization into doing something that you wouldn't be able to do without that authorization. So it doesn't matter that you've hardened your servers and encrypted your files, because somebody with the credentials to access them is being manipulated into doing something bad. Social engineering usually works because of fear, laziness, the desire to get something for free. They'll offer you a free iPad, or they'll offer to just flat out give you money to do something. Sometimes social engineering works because people genuinely want to help other people. Piggybacking kind of works like this, where you follow somebody through a door into a secured area. They'll hold the door for you. That's how nice people are. They'll literally let an attacker in and help them through. Often flattery simply works. You can act like somebody must be so important in the organization that surely they could take care of this, and pretty soon they think, yeah, I am that important to this organization. I should be able to take care of this for this person. But the attacker is generally tricking them into breaking the process that they should be following and thus bypassing some security controls. Distraction can also work. You could send a pretty girl up to a security guard and have her kind of talk and flirt with him, and then the actual attacker goes in, head down, holding a clipboard and wearing a suit, and just walks right past the security guard. The security guard might see the person but not want to interrupt his conversation with the distraction in order to let this person, who is probably just fine, walk past. Social engineering also works because people are simply not aware of social engineering tactics, and that's something I'm going to try to make you aware of in this lesson. But I also need you to train your people to be aware of these tactics, so that when they see that pretty girl flirting with them, they think, maybe it's not that I'm irresistibly handsome, maybe this is some sort of trickery and I need to keep my eye open. Here's an example of a social engineering attack that used to be really common. You used to be able to instant message somebody on, say, AOL Instant Messenger and say, hi, this is the AOL support staff. We've encountered a problem with your account. Can I confirm your identity? Will you give me your username and password? And some portion of people would just give up their username and password. You can also call people and say, hi, I'm from the US Bank. I notice you have a checking account here. There's been some suspicious activity on your account. Can you confirm your account number and PIN for me? Things like that. People, it will just work. People don't ask for credentials. They don't think to question it. There's a movie out that you should look into. It's called Compliance, and I'm not recommending it because it's a great movie, but it is a great example of real-world social engineering using fear. This movie is based on a real criminal case where a fairly benign guy, I think he was an accountant in the real world, was calling fast food places and pretending to be law enforcement. He said he was a police officer and that there was an active investigation into one of their employees for theft. So he'd talk to the manager and tell him that a specific employee by name was being accused of theft, and he didn't even bother to go to the fast food places. He tricked them into telling him the employee's name. So he'd be like, do you have an employee there who's about 5'5", dark hair, olive-toned skin? And the person would be like, you mean Mary? It's like, yes, that's Mary. What was her last name again? And so he'd get the person's full name. And then he would say, Mary is under investigation for a crime against one of your employees. I need you to detain Mary. And then he continued on, and he made the employees do ridiculous things to each other, including undressing and otherwise humiliating this woman. And it was an awful crime, but a great example of the power of fear in social engineering. They simply felt intimidated because if they didn't cooperate with the police officer, they thought they were going to be impeding the investigation of a criminal act, and they thought they themselves were going to get in trouble by not helping out the completely anonymous person on the phone with absolutely no credentials whatsoever. If you're interested in the history of social engineering, I suggest you look up a fellow called Kevin Mitnick. He's really famous to my generation of IT nerds, but newer generations might not be familiar with him. He really helped develop a lot of social engineering attacks, and unfortunately he did so wearing a black hat. Nowadays he at least seems to be wearing a white hat, but he was convicted of some really serious crimes, and I believe even now he's not allowed to physically touch a computer. So he's trying to leverage his reputation to sell security services, but oddly he's not allowed to use computers. Anyway, check out Kevin Mitnick if you're interested in more history. Impersonation is an example of social engineering, including the example of the person who was impersonating an officer that I recently gave. Impersonation is really quite simple on the phone. You simply need to be able to impersonate somebody's tone. So the man who was pretending to be a police officer, he simply spoke in an authoritative and confident tone. If you wanted to pretend to be a survey taker, you would simply need to speak as if you were speaking from a script, because most of them simply have scripts. Many people will impersonate a business's legitimate customers, even if they haven't purchased a product, because it's a way to get coupons or refunds for products that you didn't actually purchase, or, for example, replacement products when you didn't actually buy something. So one of the tactics that you might use as a pretend customer is to pretend to be really angry, insist on talking to the manager, threaten the person's job, make them feel intimidated. These are all common impersonation social engineering tactics. In-person takes a little more confidence to pull off, but it's really common to wear a disguise or a costume of some kind. So you can impersonate a maintenance person simply by putting on a tool belt and walking up confidently to a front door and say that somebody called you to replace a leaky faucet. And depending on where you are, they'll often let you right through. Same thing happens with delivery people. If you can get yourself a UPS outfit, you can walk past the front door of just about any place, even the places with good security, because they're told to allow the delivery guys through. Often you can bypass a lot of security by putting on a nice suit and acting like you're an executive of the company. You know, if you're at some small branch office, the people working at reception don't necessarily know who the executives are, and they certainly wouldn't recognize them. Well, you act like you're an executive there for a surprise inspection. And when the receptionist says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'll just need to check on this," you say, "You check on that and I will have your job." And more often than not, they will simply let you through. It's also common to impersonate law enforcement. You can put on a police uniform or simply the uniform of a security guard. They're pretty readily available on places like eBay. And people will simply trust you and tend to let you through to places that you wouldn't normally be allowed access to. This is a photo of tailgating and piggybacking, which I'll discuss more in the next slide, but I just like this example illustration created by the wonderful photographers at the train signal team of somebody sneaking in behind somebody with an actual authorized security card. This is extremely easy to do as an attacker because it's commonplace for people who aren't attackers. I can't tell you how many times I come back to lunch with a coworker and he buzzes his card and I just walk right through behind him. Maybe there's even somebody else behind them and I know them and I let them through. This kind of thing leads to bad habits. Because what if you let somebody through and then the person behind them you don't know, but the person that you let in just holds the door open and then one more person walks through. Sometimes you'll stop them and say, "Hey, do you have your badge?" And they'll say, "Oh yes, it's right here. I'm sorry, I didn't dig it out of my purse." And when that happens a few times, when you actually stop somebody for tailgating or piggybacking and they prove that they are an authorized user, pretty soon you think everybody who's walking through this door is authorized. Why am I bothering all these legitimate people? And then you stop bothering people. And then somebody who is an attacker manages to sneak through. That's why these attacks work, because legitimate authorized users tailgate and piggyback through doors all the time because their security cards are a pain to pull out, or they've forgotten their security card at their desk, or they left their security card at home. So they just sneak through the door, but they are authorized. And 99 times out of 100, they're authorized users, but that one time out of 100, It's going to be somebody who's going to do something bad to your facility or to your network, and they're sneaking in. And that's why you just have to remain vigilant. In my experience, the simplest way to do this is just to pretend to smoke. Now, don't actually smoke, because that's bad, right? That causes cancer. But learn how to smoke, and then you can just hang outside of a security door smoking like any number of employees would outside of a building. And nobody thinks anything of it, because who would be smoking right outside of a door except for an employee who was just bored silly at their job and needed some nicotine, right? Well, when somebody goes through, you wait until that door closes and then almost latches, and then you grab the door, you put out your cigarette, and you walk through. You seem completely nonchalant, and you can gain access to almost any building that way. It's also really nice to just come in with a big stack of boxes and your arms completely full and, dressed for work. Put on business casual or put on a full suit or whatever would make you look like you worked there. Come in with all these boxes, and you know what? Somebody's just going to grab the door for you and open it up. You can even use the boxes to cover your face, and they won't think twice of it, and they're trying to be helpful. It's also pretty easy to sneak into a large crowd. And when do large crowds come into buildings? Well, there are 2 times a day. In the morning when people show up for work, and then after lunch. So show up at a building at 8:30, 9 in the morning, whenever work tends to start, and then at 1 o'clock whenever people get back from lunch. And you'll see lots and lots of people filing in from the parking lot just in big groups. And you just jump in. Certainly, if there are 10 people walking in, I've never seen somebody make a point of closing and latching the door and then making each one of those 10 people scan their cards. No, they just hold the door open for each individual that walks through, and you can easily just sneak into the group. You can also do that when there's a large exodus of people. So Friday before the 3-day weekend, that would be a good time to sneak into a building, because there's going to be a lot of people leaving the back doors of the building. You just wait until that door opens and then almost latches, and then stomp on your cigarette and walk on through. Another technique is dumpster diving, and that's going through an individual or company's trash for information that might be useful. And you'd be surprised, there's actually a lot of really good information to be found in people's trash. And it's also kind of legally questionable. Depending on where you are and where the trash is located, trash is often considered to be public property. Law enforcement in the United States has had a history of going through potential suspects' trash when it's at the curb waiting to be picked up, because in many areas it's considered to be public property at that point. Technically, anybody can go through it. So law enforcement doesn't necessarily have to wait for a search warrant to dig through somebody's trash. That also means if you catch somebody dumpster diving, depending on where you are and where the trash is located, you might not actually be able to stop them or press charges against them. Yes, they might actually be able to go through your trash. I talk about how to combat that in another lesson. Some of the things that you might find while dumpster diving include passwords. You know why? Because people write their passwords on little post-it notes, and then they stick them to the monitor. Or maybe they're more inconspicuous and they write it on a piece of paper and then hide it in their desk drawer. Well, at some point they go to clean out their desk and they throw it in the trash, and then it ends up in the trash bin. Receipts are often also in the trash, and you'd be surprised how much a receipt can tell you. For example, if you were to look at a company's receipts in aggregate, you might be able to see that a lot of their employees were going to visit the headquarters of a competitor. That might indicate an impending merger. You might also see that they're investing in a lot of particular hardware that would be used to manufacture, say, silicon chips. And you could say, oh, this company might be getting into the chip business. And that can be really valuable information to either competitors or investors. You can also often find financial information. Nowadays, accountants and finance people are generally well trained enough to shred everything before it goes out, but not everybody, especially casual bookkeepers. Many offices have an office manager who's not necessarily formally trained in finance, but they end up taking on a lot of accounting tasks. And as a result of their not having formal training, they might not know to properly dispose of all the information. And thus, it basically becomes public information once it hits their trash bin. This photo from the nice folks at Train Signal who impersonate criminals but are not actually criminals shows somebody shoulder surfing in what looks to be about 1991 from the size of that big old Dell monitor. Shoulder surfing is simply looking over somebody's shoulder and you can see what they're typing. It's the reason that when you type your password, it shows little dots or asterisks instead of the letters that you type. But you can still look at somebody's hands and see what they're typing. And this is particularly easy if you're one of these two-finger typists. If you just poke out your two fingers and you type, anybody can pretty much see the letters that you're typing. This guy is actually a touch typist, and that makes it harder to shoulder surf, certainly, but you can still see what's going on. Besides spying on somebody's password, you can also use it to pick up somebody's PIN number. If you're at an ATM, the security-wise person will cover their hand with their other hand or their body when they're typing their PIN. You know why? Because if a criminal sees your PIN, they very well might pull out a weapon, a gun or a knife, and say, "Give me your card." Because they now know your PIN, they don't even need you, but they will rob you of your card and then go to an ATM and pull out all your cash. Therefore, showing your PIN actually makes you more of a victim. So you're not necessarily hiding your PIN at the ATM to protect your money, but you're protecting yourself from being robbed and being placed in the way of physical violence. Now, one nice thing about shoulder surfing is that the attacker must typically have physical access, but they might just need physical access to your window. In big cities, places like New York City, with skyscrapers that face each other, there have been successful shoulder surfing attacks done from other buildings. You can line up a telescope or a big telephoto lens and watch somebody working at their computer in a different building. You really can. And you can see enough detail with modern optics to see the exact letters that you type. So I could take my camera and a big telephoto lens and literally just record somebody working at their computer throughout the day. And because I'm recording it to video, I can go back at my leisure, fast forward and wait till I see them type their password. Then I can go frame by frame to see the individual letters that they type for their username and password. And then I have their credentials. So don't keep your back to a window, okay? Eavesdropping is more of an audible form of shoulder surfing. The guy at the cubicle next to you can hear what you're saying. So if you go to give your account number or something over the phone, they can pick it up. I really hate it when I call my bank or something else that needs to authenticate me and they want me to just say my social security number over the phone. Because if I'm within earshot of anybody else, then they have my social security number and they're using it to authenticate me. Therefore, it must be important, right? But you're asking me to share it with everybody within earshot. So it's kind of a scary thing, and you basically just have to excuse yourself to a different room. Somebody with physical access to your desk might also just go through your files. They can come up with a reasonable excuse. Maybe they say they're looking for a particular file, or they're looking for a pencil or a stapler. But what they're actually looking for is confidential information, maybe passwords, maybe personal information about you. So don't hide things around your desk. And if you do, actually lock it up. Don't rely on security through obscurity. There are no sneaky places to hide stuff in your desk because attackers know where to look. Of course, spam is one of the most common and costly forms of attack, and it's just kind of an annoyance, but it eats away at your time and your storage and your network capacity just bit by bit and ends up costing really quite a bit. Spam as a general term is just any sort of unwanted or unsolicited communication. You know, it used to just mean unwanted emails, but nowadays it also refers to faxes and even physical mail that gets delivered that you don't necessarily want. Of course, there's money behind it. Somebody who's sending spam usually wants to make some money, but they don't have a great return rate on that. They have to send tens of thousands of messages just to get a penny or two. So they've developed techniques to allow them to send just millions and millions and millions of emails out just for hopes of getting a couple of $100s back. And for that reason, we all get inundated with a lot of spam that costs us something and doesn't make anybody any money. I also want you to be familiar with the term spam, which is just spam over instant messenger. I actually turn off Skype and a couple of other instant messengers because I was just getting constant spam all the time. It always would be like a picture of some gal and she'd be like, "Hey, want to chat on my webcam?" Like, I don't really think so. First, I don't believe that some young gal is going to want to be chatting up some random IT guy, but second, we all know that these are the types of tactics that spam and spam attackers will use to get your attention. Spam also occurs in forums and news groups, and really any place you can put down or write information will be spammed in one way or another. Once they actually get your attention with the spam, they have to try to get some kind of money out of you. So sometimes they'll just try to sell you a product. For example, if you're using spam to sell your book, well, they can just track down the person selling the book and say, hey, quit it, we're going to block your emails. Or if you're sending spam using illegal tactics, they might be able to hold you accountable in the court of law. So spam is not often used to sell legitimate products. Instead, they'll try to sell you something that's not legit, or they'll just try to get you to click on a link that will install malware on your computer, and then once malware is on your computer, they can try to extract money out of you in many other ways, as I've discussed in other lessons. At best, spam takes up storage on your email servers, it steals away your productivity while you're thinking about how to get rid of that spam, and you have to spend some money on anti-spam software. That's if you don't ever fall for any of the tactics of spam, which I don't think many people do nowadays. Anyway, it's still costing us all money, and there's not really anything we can do about it. Another common tactic is phishing, and I have a couple of example screenshots after this slide that I'll show you. In general, phishing is anything that's pretending to be a trusted person or a website. It often comes in as an email. Recently, I was getting emails that seemed to be from UPS saying that there was a problem delivering one of my packages. And being that I was sending and receiving packages on a regular basis, I thought it might be legit. And they actually got me to not only read the email, but investigate the links. Now, I didn't actually click the links. I was able to hover my cursor over the links in my email app and see that the links weren't pointing to ups.com, but some other website. And therefore, I could tell it wasn't a legitimate request. And I did what everybody should do. Instead of clicking the links in the email, I went directly to UPS's website, typing the address into my browser, and went to check it out to see if there was actually any problem, and of course it wasn't. You'll get messages like this that seem to be from your bank too, saying, oh my goodness, your account is overdrawn. Click this link to resolve the problem right away. If you're not sure if it's fake or not, open a browser and visit your bank's website, but don't click the link. Phishing emails and websites can be absolutely indistinguishable from the original, because it's really easy to just copy a website. All the HTML is public, right? So you just copy it, you take a screenshot of it, whatever. So don't think that you can look at it and be like, oh, no, that logo looks legit. There's really no way you can do that. It can all be easily faked. You should be particularly wary if there's something in the message that is creating a sense of urgency or fear in you. Saying something like, your account is overdrawn, you could be faced with large fines, or your package is going to be destroyed if you don't respond to this immediately, makes you think you need to do it right away. You don't put it off. You don't investigate it further. You probably just click on it in that moment of panic. In other words, they're exploiting your fear to get you to do something. Here's an excellent example of this. This email appears to be from Yahoo Mail, and indeed it has the actual Yahoo logo in there. And they're prompting you for your Yahoo ID and password and then some other identifying information such as your birthday. They're saying if you don't do this, then your account is going to be deleted. And of course, this is somebody's email account, supposedly, so they're going to want to keep it. In fact, they've even got a little CAPTCHA there to make them seem more legit, though they're probably not so concerned with the CAPTCHA as they are about capturing your password. If you were to fill that form in and submit it, they would have your account. They would immediately log in using your credentials and probably change the password so that you can get in and change it back. Next up, the good old denial of service attack. With the denial of service attack, an attacker submits a request to the victim. And the request is specially formed to try to overload the victim. Sometimes it's a legit request, like just retrieving probably the largest web page on a website, and the victim then has to respond with this very large web page. If you send requests in too quickly, the victim won't be able to reply anymore to either an attacker or a legitimate user. And because legitimate users cannot access the site, well, the denial of service is then considered successful. Denial of service is effective anytime it costs less to submit a request than it does to respond to it. A web page is a great example of that. To request a web page, the attacker needs to send the phrase get / to the web server. That's it. Just 3 characters, a space, and then a /, and the victim will need to respond with what could be a kilobyte or 2 kilobytes of a web page. Sometimes they can be quite large. So in this case, the attacker is sending out something little, and the victim needs to send out something big. If the attacker had to send out something big to get the victim to send out something little, well, it wouldn't make much sense for the attacker. It would cost the attacker a lot more than it did the victim, and the denial of service in theory wouldn't be effective. Denial of services attack the A in the CIA triad, availability, as you might recall, by taking a service offline for legitimate users. It can be any sort of service. It could be a telephone hotline. You can take a telephone service offline by simply placing a whole bunch of inbound calls until all the circuits are full. With computers on a network, you simply submit a bunch of requests to them. 10, 20 years ago, denial of service attacks were far easier and more effective than they are today. Often you could just send a few requests to a server and it would just cause it to crash until an administrator got around to rebooting it. Nowadays, denial of service attacks are so common that software developers basically plan for it. So every major web server out there is designed to handle DOS attacks as efficiently as possible, and they generally won't simply crash. They have no choice but to slow down and even completely go offline, but they will rebound automatically once the DOS attack is stopped. DOS attacks need to overfill some performance bottleneck, and typically that bottleneck is either outgoing bandwidth from a server or can simply be computing power. If you can send out a request that takes up a bunch of processing time on the computer, such as searching records for one particular record, well, all you need to do is send enough of those requests that the CPU hits 100% and can no longer process additional requests, and it will stay offline until it manages to work through the queue of illegitimate DOS requests. Now here's the evil child of the denial of service attack, the distributed denial of service attack. I mentioned that software had gotten sophisticated enough that most simple DOS attacks from one computer were no longer that effective. But there is no great workaround for a distributed denial of service attack that simply floods your internet connection with so much data that you can't get anything else out. The way these typically work is by using a botnet. Botnet is a large network of thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of computers known as bots or zombies. And a master computer commands them to do something bad. So the master computer will send out a signal to the thousands of computers, and then these zombies will all initiate an attack on a victim. And because there are so many of them using their big old home broadband connections, they can bring down just about any website. Distributed denial of service attacks happen all the time, every day, to large websites and individuals sitting at home who might have made somebody mad on a Minecraft server. They're happening all the time. ISPs are starting to develop some ways to automatically detect and block these DDoS attacks, but the type of monitoring and automated response software isn't as sophisticated as it could be. Well, there certainly are organizations who specialize in this kind of thing who have very strong defenses to distributed denial of service attacks. Places like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, they're pretty well protected from these. They have complex networking systems in place that can detect it and kind of cut off the communications from these hundreds of thousands of computers fairly quickly, keeping their services online. But an awful lot of smaller ISPs don't have this sophistication. So you might be able to use the distributed denial of service attack to pretty much shut off an entire ISP if they don't have the proper systems in place. Here's a real example of a DOS attack and the consequences of it. Now, this information is all based on news articles that are in turn based on court records. So I don't speak about this with any firsthand experience, and I don't know Joseph Resendez or what he might have done, but this seems to be what the court records indicate. They indicate that one Joseph Resendez was angry about a traffic ticket that he got from his local county government. So from the period of September 22nd, 2010 to September 24th, 2010, and then October 4th to October 6th of the same year, Joe attacked the Larimer County's government IT systems using a denial of service attack, and it was effective. For that period of, 6 days, he brought down their access to email, county records, and even their telephone system. So they were pretty much off the map and couldn't get any work done. 6 work days, even for the government, that's a lot. That could amount to, 10, 20 hours of actual productive work. That's a joke. I'm making fun of the efficiency of government systems. Anyway, they naturally called the local police department, and in turn they called the FBI to come check this out because, well, the FBI is particularly good at these sorts of computer crimes, but the local PD doesn't tend to be computer experts, so the FBI often jumps in to lend a helping hand. And they did manage to track Resendez down. They arrested him and brought him to court, at which time he pled guilty. The judge sentenced him to 18 months in federal prison and 3 years parole. So as you can see, while executing a DOS attack doesn't necessarily feel the same as holding up a bank at gunpoint, it feels a little cleaner and nicer because you're sitting politely at your desk and you're only attacking IT systems. The consequences are just as real. If somebody commits a DOS attack, you really can spend time in prison and you really can be tracked down no matter how you try to cover your tracks. The Smurf attack is a really old attack. Like, this ruined weeks for me in the 90s when I was working at BBN. But nowadays, you don't really hear about Smurf attacks just because networking equipment has been upgraded. But it was mentioned in the SSCP certification objective, so I want you to be familiar with the term Smurf. Smurf is sending ping requests that are spoofed to seem like they come from the target computer that you want to attack. So you can send out ping requests to hundreds, thousands of different computers with a source IP address of the computer that you want to attack. They all politely respond to the ping, but they're not sending the ping responses back to you. They're sending them to the computer that you're attacking. And these ping replies can be so numerous that they completely saturate the bandwidth on that target computer. Now, back in the 90s, spoofing was pretty easy because most people's routers simply forwarded packets to the destination and didn't do any kind of check. Nowadays, it's completely standard for every router to check this source IP address, and routers don't forward a packet with a source IP address that's not a legit address for the network it's coming from. So you could only spoof another IP address on the same network. You couldn't send a packet out and pretend that it came from a different country, for example, or even a different ISP. It would still have to come from your specific network, making it much easier to track down the attacker for this type of thing. It would also mean that on modern networks, a Smurf attack could only be successful within a LAN, within a single local area network. And I don't know why you'd be attacking a computer across the network or why you need to use a Smurf attack to do it. Heck, if it's on your own network, just walk over there and unplug it if that's what you want to do. Anyway, Smurf attacks, they're of historical significance, and I want you to know the term, but it's not really something you need to worry about too much now. Pretty much networks in their default configuration will prevent them from happening. Improvements in cryptography have pretty much alleviated the concern of replay attacks. Replay attacks, however, used to be really common. Again, back in the early days of the modern internet in the 90s, there were lots of protocols that required a username and password. Sometimes they even added some sort of hashing or cryptography to it, but they used cryptography that would be exactly the same every time you sent the password. So your password wouldn't travel across the network in clear text. Some hash of it would. Therefore, somebody could capture the communications and not know your password. But somebody figured out, I don't need to know the password. I have this hash of their password. I'll just send that instead. Because you're capturing communications and then replaying them exactly, it's called a replay attack. And again, with modern protocols, we don't really see this being effective anymore. When you look at older protocols from the 80s and 90s, lots of them were vulnerable to replay attacks, however. So it's always worth looking into the protocols and cryptography that you use just to make sure it's up to date and following all modern best practices. Farming is something that I've basically discussed already, but I want to introduce the term on its own. Farming is like phishing, but mixing in some DNS spoofing. Now, DNS, as you probably already know, is a system of name resolution on the internet. It takes a friendly name, like trainsignal.com, and turns it into an IP address that computers can use to communicate directly. Anytime you visit a website, your computer has to submit a DNS request to a DNS server and figure out that website's IP address before it can talk to it. Now, if you can manage to modify the response coming back from the DNS server, you can send somebody to your own website instead of the website that they're actually trying to visit. So what happens is people will attack a DNS server, or they'll modify the static host file that performs DNS on a local computer, and they'll change the IP address of a website that the user is likely to visit. Once they get you to visit the malicious website using the legitimate name, they'll trick you into entering your username and password. Basically, they just need to present you the exact same user interface that the legit website does. You'll type it in and they'll have your credentials. Here's what a farming or phishing website might look like. This is literally just my bank's website. There's nothing suspicious about it, but it's very easy just to copy the whole website. So there's absolutely no way you can simply visually detect that you're under this sort of attack. And now I'll quickly demonstrate how to modify a host file to perform a farming or man-in-the-middle type attack, just to show you how easily it can be done. This is File Explorer on my Windows 8 PC, and you can see I've navigated to the C drive, Windows System 32 drivers etc. And in this folder are a bunch of text files that don't have any file extension. They don't have a file extension because we hadn't really invented file extensions at the time we came up with this technology, which is back in the late 60s, 70s, and the 80s. Before we had a hierarchical centralized DNS system, we put host files on every single computer. And let's open up the host file so you can see the format of it. Just going to right-click it and then click Open With. It doesn't have a file extension, so it doesn't get associated with the default app. So I'll choose to open it with Notepad. And this is the format of the host file. You can see it's an IP address and then some sort of computer name or host name. And you can see I've used this for testing some systems in the past. But for now, I will use it to demonstrate a farming or man-in-the-middle attack. I'll put in the IP address of my own web server, and then I'll type the name of a website that I want to impersonate. I'll do wikipedia.org. Now I just need to save this file, and I'll switch over to a browser. Now what's going to happen is when I attempt to visit wikipedia.org, instead of looking up Wikipedia's IP address in the DNS system, it's going to check the host file. Your computer always checks the host file first. And it's going to use this IP address instead of the public IP address. Then it will go to my own site, which is a very powerful thing. So let's demonstrate that now. Here in the browser, I'll type wikipedia.org. And look, you end up at my website. Now, my website doesn't look much like Wikipedia, but it would be a really simple thing for me to copy the front page of Wikipedia and put it here, and I might be able to prompt somebody for their credentials. Now, that's just Wikipedia, but you could exercise the same type of attack against any website, including a user's bank. The moral of the story is protect your DNS infrastructure and protect that little host file on each of your local computers because it's extremely easy to exploit. Another type of attack that often involves corrupting the name resolution system is a man-in-the-middle attack. Normally, if things are going correctly, the client A talks to the server B. However, in a man-in-the-middle attack, an attacker positions his computer between the two, on the network at least, reroutes communications from client A to server B through its own man-in-the-middle machine. Then all those communications are automatically forwarded on to the legitimate server, and all the responses get forwarded back. Now this looks exactly like a legit proxy server. And in fact, the man-in-the-middle computer gains all the same capabilities of a proxy server. It can inspect every packet, including your usernames and passwords. All you have to do to execute a man-in-the-middle attack is corrupt the DNS system, just like I did with the host file. It's that easy, and you have the full ability to eavesdrop or modify data between the client and server. And without some additional authentication, it can be impossible to detect. With websites, that additional layer of security is pretty easy. Adding HTTPS with an SSL certificate will allow the client to detect the man in the middle, or the man in the middle will have to simply act as a proxy and forward all the encrypted traffic, preventing them from eavesdropping. Therefore, man-in-the-middle attacks aren't all that effective when a website is protected with HTTPS. However, it can be very effective against non-HTTPS protected websites or other types of protocols and applications. Here's a diagram that shows spoofing. With spoofing, there's a fake client that pretends to be the real client. So you can see the spoofed client over here, labeled C, is pretending to be A, and it's communicating with a server who thinks he legitimately is A. However, the actual client A isn't connected or doing anything related whatsoever. So spoofing is basically impersonating a legitimate client on a network with the purpose of gaining some elevated privileges or getting access to some information that you wouldn't otherwise have. Usually you're executing IP address spoofing, so you can easily change the IP address in your computer to be any IP address. And if the network isn't configured to drop the traffic from spoofed IP addresses, then anybody receiving communications from you will just think that your computer has that IP address legitimately. Now, spoofing is a pretty hard attack to execute on modern networks for a couple of different reasons. For one, networks by default will just drop traffic from IP addresses that aren't considered legit for that network. So you couldn't spoof IP addresses from other networks, you could only spoof IP addresses from your network. Also, if you were to try to spoof an IP address from a different network, you couldn't get any responses back because the server would be responding to the IP address that you were spoofing, which is on some other network that you don't have access to. So client A would be getting response packets and its firewall would probably be dropping it saying, that's not part of an active connection. I don't know why you're sending me that. But you could never get any information back, even if you were to successfully spoof another client. Besides IP address spoofing, there's also ARP spoofing. ARP is the address resolution protocol, and while IP spoofing works at the OC layer 3, ARP works at OC layer 2. That's like the Ethernet layer. That's communications happening just across a local area network. And ARP spoofing is pretty easy. You can pretty much assign any MAC address to your computer's network adapter, and then you could impersonate a router or another client on your local network. MAC addresses aren't commonly used for authentication, so ARP spoofing doesn't really get you anywhere. And you can't use ARP spoofing to cross network boundaries because it is a layer 2 protocol. That kind of thing is basically stripped out. So what do you get for it? Not much, but I want you to be familiar with it. DNS spoofing can be pretty dangerous. If you can successfully impersonate a user's DNS server, then it allows you to execute man-in-the-middle and farming attacks, as I demonstrated earlier, by editing the host file. Except you wouldn't need to edit the host file. You wouldn't need any privileges to the local computer at all. You would just need to be able to spoof their DNS server. You could do that in a couple of different ways. You could modify the network configuration so that requests being sent to the legit DNS server are rerouted to your malicious server. You could also attack the DHCP servers, which provide the DNS configuration to clients on the network, and tell the DHCP server that your malicious server is the new DNS server for the local network. If you were able to modify the configuration of a local host, you could go in and modify its DNS settings directly so that it sent requests to your server instead of the legitimate DNS server. Now I'll talk about another common attack, and that's cross-site scripting. Cross-site scripting, also known as XSS, exploits the trust a user's browser has for a site. When you visit a site, your browser will typically just execute JavaScript that comes from the site. And back in the olden days, browsers pretty much just did this indiscriminately. Whatever JavaScript was there, it would just run it. If there was an embedded link, such as an image, it would just retrieve it without thinking twice about it. And attackers figured out how to use this to their advantage. You can see some HTML code on the slide there. And this HTML code is an embedded image, at least in theory. But you can see it has a width and a height of 1, which means it would be a single pixel, and users would probably not notice it. However, the source for the image is a script, an ASPX file, which is running on a malicious server, attacker.contoso.com. Now you also notice that it starts with the word hi. That's indicating that it was typed into the comments field of a web page. And that's probably the easiest way to execute an XSS attack. Just type in some malicious HTML into a comment form, and then the website will just post it there. And anybody who goes to visit that site, well, their browser thinks that anything that's part of the page must be trusted in the same way that the site is trusted, except really you've got these potentially malicious comments from anybody on the entire internet that have become part of the page. Nowadays, you'll notice you often can't type HTML into comments. Sometimes they'll let you do some really limited HTML, but you can't put JavaScript in, certainly. And they do that to help prevent cross-site scripting attacks. If you're responsible for writing code for a website, don't accept HTML from users. Make sure that everything is sanitized or HTMLified. If you see a left angle bracket, replace it with the HTML code for left angle bracket. I think it's like &LT. Do the same thing for greater than brackets and quotes and anything else that might be used in HTML. You can just literally display the original code to the users as a comment without allowing the browser to interpret it as code. The opposite of that is a cross-site request forgery attack, CSRF. Whereas with a cross-site scripting attack, the browser is putting too much trust into the content on a web server. With a cross-site request forgery attack, the website is trusting the browser too much. So to execute this type of attack, you basically just trick a person into either viewing an image or clicking a link that leads to a web page that they've already visited and authenticated on. Now, for it to be effective at all, that website needs to have a cookie for them. It needs to already trust them. So I put in an example link, which won't work at all, by the way, it's just an example, but this one goes to facebook.com, and supposedly it's running some sort of page which would add a friend. If you could, in theory, trick somebody into viewing the HTML here, which should display an image, what would happen is their browser would visit facebook.com and run this page. And theoretically, if they'd already logged into facebook.com, it might have you automatically add them as a friend. Like I said, this attack won't work, but it is an example of how cross-site request forgery attacks work. I'd also like to briefly talk about Sql Injection Attacks. Sql is the standard query language. It's a type of very simple programming language used to retrieve information from a database or to update the database. So an example Sql query is something like shown here. Select has shipped from orders. There might be a table called orders which has a list of the orders in it, and this query would return all orders that have already shipped. So this query might be executed as part of a web page where people just wanted to see orders that had shipped. And here you can see it's adding a clause in where ID equals, and then it's entering in the user input for an ID. So this web page, the developer designed it to retrieve all shipped orders with a specific ID. However, you can't trust user input in any application, so along comes some malicious user, and instead of typing in a legitimate ID, they type in a number and then a special character here, an apostrophe, which Sql uses as a delimiter. And then they typed in another Sql command, drop table customers. And this final hyphen basically closes the command. What happens is this code up here takes that user input, adds it to the query that was statically listed here, and ends up creating this legitimate Sql query, which begins with a legitimate query, but then ends with a command to drop the customers table, which I guess would pretty much devastate the database, right? If you were to suddenly lose all records of your customers, your app would no longer work, and then your app would be offline. So that's what a Sql injection attack does. It takes an opportunity for legitimate user input and forms it in a malicious way to modify the underlying database. I just want you to be aware of this type of thing because it's the type of thing that application developers have to think about. They have to write their code so that they never trust user input. All user input needs to be sanitized. So in this particular example, since the code is looking for the user to enter in a numeric ID, there should be code in here that turns their user input into a number. And if it can't be converted into a proper number, then it just rejects it. And that would completely eliminate the possibility of this particular form being used for a Sql injection attack. Another common form of attack nowadays is the social network attack. So these attacks use Facebook, Twitter, or any other social network out there. And there are a bunch of different ways that you can execute these attacks. The first is simply to post links in social networks and get people to click on those links and lead them to malware or something else. Often the way that this is executed is by using an evil twin attack. So if you can compromise one user's account, then you can use their account to post a bunch of spammy links that lead to malware. But when their friends log on to Facebook and they're like, oh my goodness, Mary has posted another crazy picture of cats. I'm going to click on that. And next thing you know, your computer has been compromised by malware. So if you can manage to compromise one user's account on social networks, often you can leverage that to get elevated privileges with other people's accounts. Bullying is another type of social network attack, and that's not a code word for some more sophisticated type of attack. I literally just mean like grade school kind of bullying. You can just be mean to people on social networks. I just felt like it was worth mentioning because it comes up in all the literature when you look into different types of social network attacks. Identity theft has also become really common on social networks. If somebody can become your friend on a social network, they can get a lot of insight into your life. They can figure out maybe where you were born and your mother's maiden name and your father's middle name. If these questions sound familiar, it's because they're often used to reset account passwords. So if you can find this type of information, then you can start to reset somebody's accounts and you can gain access to their identities on different websites, maybe even figure out their password and their social security number. And pretty soon you have all the information you need to open up a credit card or get a mortgage in their name. Be careful of the information that you put up on social networks, and also make sure that it's limited just to your friends. Also be careful with who your friends are on social networks. Now, you're welcome to friend me. I have like 1,200 friends on Facebook, so look me up, Tony Northrup. But you'll find I don't put up any identifying personal information that wouldn't be publicly available otherwise. Many people aren't so careful. They'll leave their Facebook at the default settings, which reveals an awful lot of their personal information on their about page. So you might be able to ascertain somebody's address and phone number and different email addresses and use that to attack them. Social networks are also frequently used for extortion. So you can friend somebody by putting up a picture of a pretty girl, and you know what? A lot of the guys will just accept a friend request from a pretty girl that they don't know. Don't do that. If you don't legit know somebody, you shouldn't accept their friend request. I know I said I do that, but do as I say and not as I do, right? Well, this has happened time and time again. You'll get a request from a pretty girl and she'll start flirting and it'll escalate. And then you know what happens? She says, I would like $5,000 or I'm going to send this conversation to your wife. That extortion happens, and it happens frequently. Now, in the corporate world, this could be used to get some secrets out of somebody. You could figure out which people are employees of a particular company, start sending them flirtatious messages, and if you send them to 10, 20 guys, you know what? You're going to get a couple of responses back. And pretty soon, you'll have people looking up some private information. Certainly would be better than their wives finding out about it, right? So that's the kind of thing you need to look out for on social networks. And you need to educate the users and employees of your organization about those risks. Here's a really simple example of a social network attack on Twitter. You can see the tweet there. Somebody said, hey, 23 female, come chat with me on my webcam thingy here. And then it just provided a link to malware. When somebody clicked on the website, it would perform a drive-by. And the website had a JavaScript-based malware installer that would exploit a vulnerability in the user's browser. Once installed, the malware would tweet that same message again, continuing the cycle. And thousands of users were infected. There are a couple of ways to prevent this. I mean, first, keep your browsers up to date. Second, no 23-year-old female wants to come chat with you on her webcam thingy. They don't. So don't bother to click on the links. It's fake. It's just another nerd like you or me trying to do the wrong thing. The only difference is they're wearing a black hat and not a white hat. Up last, I'd like to talk about the most grand of the attacks, the APT, the Advanced Persistent Attack. This is a long-term, sophisticated attack that the average script kiddie can't pull off. In fact, the average hacking organization can't pull it off. The attacker here is typically a government or military organization. Like, they have paid employees, people who work 60, 80 hours a week just figuring out attacks, and then teams of these people. They might have actual spies physically going and investigating the facilities to, say, do dumpster diving and gather information that the attackers can use to hack your networks. APTs are not any particular type of attack. Instead, they typically use multiple different attack types. So they will use malware, and they will use social networking attacks, and they'll use cross-site scripting and drive-bys and viruses and worms and anything else they can use to get into your network. This sounds scary, and it is, and it's very real. Recently, the US government has been accused, and there's enough details in there that I tend to believe it, of launching an APT against Iran called Stuxnet. And this attack was pretty successful in delaying some important manufacturing that the US government is saying was to help Iran develop nuclear powers. China is also accused of carrying out long-term APT attacks against the US government and individual corporations, mostly to gather secret information to help their own industry and technology. So they basically want to steal secrets to further their own efforts. Now, this is all alleged and just based on news articles that I've read, but I wouldn't tell you if I hadn't done quite a bit of research and feel comfortable that these things are actually happening. I do believe China is performing a long-term APT against the US, and I do believe the US performed successfully an APT against Iran. So here's some common scenarios where we see APT. Probably the most common now is a military attack. More and more hacking is becoming part of a military act. And the missions are most often espionage, which would be gathering confidential information, or destruction of IT systems, as Stuxnet did to Iran. The targets of these types of attacks tend to be government agencies, contractors thereof, or simply politicians. We also see industrial espionage or corporate spying. The mission here might be to gather insider information so that maybe you could make some illegal stock trades and make a profit. You could also gather trade secrets and sell them to competitors, or leverage those trade secrets to make your own business more efficient. Or you might just decide to set your competitor back a notch and actually destroy their IT systems and slow down the progress of their work. Imagine if a competitor managed to get access to your IT systems, and what they did was just corrupt your backups. And then, I don't know, wait 6 months. And then 6 months later, destroy all of your systems. They'd know that you didn't have any backups for 6 months and they'd taken all of your systems offline. How devastating would that be to your company? The typical targets for industrial espionage include businesses and the contractors of businesses, as well as the individual employees. For example, they might use social networking to attack an individual employee and use extortion to get the employee to provide them some credentials to the internal network. And then once they get those internal credentials, they can leverage that to get more power on the internal network until they can actually control the systems they need to control. The third type of APT that I'll talk about is hacktivism. And I've seen this a lot lately. The anonymous hacking group, that's the name they go by. They've been really active in hacktivism lately, and some of their attacks are sophisticated enough to be considered APT. They'll do this to damage the reputation of an organization they don't like. They'll do it to expose corruption or to make private data public, because whatever organization it might be might have the ideal that all data should be public, or they might think that, say, government secrets should be revealed to the world so that they can judge them for themselves. It can also be vigilante justice. If they think somebody has done wrong and didn't receive proper justice, they might use hacktivism to hurt them in some way. Lately, the typical targets have been governments, businesses, contractors thereof, as well as the employees. They've also been attacking individuals and, religious organizations, military organizations, really anybody who makes them mad or does something against their ideals is a potential target. Here's the typical APT process. It's such a complex and multi-pronged attack that there's no one process, but I just want to show you just how long-term this can be. They'll begin by simply defining their target, establishing what their mission is. Then they will research the target. And again, this isn't using one particular technique, but it's using multiple techniques. So they might break into the facilities by using piggybacking, and they might go dumpster diving to gain more information. They'll find out as much about the internal systems and architecture as they can. They'll make long lists of all the employees, and they'll identify people who have legitimate access to those internal systems so that they can try to compromise their credentials or extort them. After you're done with the reconnaissance and you have a map of your target, you begin to organize your tools and accomplices. So you pull together a bunch of hacking tools that you're going to use, and maybe some of those tools are actually individuals who have an in-depth knowledge of how to, say, finely craft Sql Injection Attacks, or they know how to modify the internal systems. You might need specialists in the language who can read internal documentation in a foreign language, for example. Up next, the actual intrusion. You do this carefully because you want to avoid detection, but you try to gain elevated privileges to one system on the internal network, again without being discovered. And then once you get into one system, you begin to expand. So if you take over one computer, that's probably not enough, because that computer, well, it could just have a hard drive failure. It could be something totally coincidental, and then you've lost access. So you try to expand to every computer. You try to make your presence pervasive, because then it's practically impossible to eliminate you. Once you thoroughly own their network, then you can actually perform your mission. So in the case of Stuxnet, the US's attack against Iran, allegedly this was executing a firmware rootkit against some manufacturing equipment that they had, and they executed some special code that caused the equipment to basically destroy itself, setting back the manufacturing process. In the case of the Chinese's attacks against different US organizations, this is probably just gathering information. The final step in this is to destroy the evidence. The US didn't want the world to know about Stuxnet, and the Chinese certainly didn't want the US to know about their own efforts. In fact, both organizations are continuing to officially deny these acts, even though there seems to be a substantial amount of information to the contrary. I'm able to name a couple of APT efforts because they didn't successfully destroy all the evidence, but I'm confident that there were hundreds or thousands of efforts of similar scale where they were able to completely destroy the evidence and cover their tracks, and we'll simply never know about them. This is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and thanks so much for watching this video lesson.